My name is Mike Savage. I work at the LSE. I'm Professor of Sociology, and I also convene a programme of research at the International Inequalities Institute around the themes of wealth, elites and tax justice. And I'm very pleased to welcome Tomiwa Owolade to our online audience and our audience in person. Tomiwa writes about cultural, social and literary issues for the New Statesman, the Times, the Sunday Times, the Observer, Unheard and the Evening Standard. And he is the author of a book published next week, I think. This is Not America, Why Black Lives in Britain Matter. So today we'll be exploring some of the themes in Tomiwa's new book, in which he argues that too much of the conversation around race and racism in Britain is viewed through American spectacles that don't reflect the history, challenges and achievements of an increasingly diverse black population here in the UK. Should be an exciting and enjoyable discussion. For those Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is hash LSE Festival. So please do use that if you're on Twitter to spread the word about this event, but also about the book. Please can you put your phones on silent? The event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast, so long as there are no technical difficulties. The plan will be, I think, for Tomiwa to speak for about 15 minutes or so. I will then ask him a few questions and have a discussion with him about some of the themes of the book, which I have read in advance, and which also links to some of the work I've been doing around questions of race and class in the UK and internationally. So we'll do that for another 15 minutes or so. Then we'll throw it open to the audience for any questions you may have. And the questions will be open to people online, but also to people in person. We'll try and make sure you both get a chance, both groups get a chance to contribute to the debate. Okay, so let's move on. Tomiwa, do you want to say a few words about your book and why we should read it and what its highlights are?
You should read my book because it's amazing. Thank you very much, Mike, for that warm and insightful introduction. So the initial idea for the book came to me in the summer of 2020 during the height of the George Floyd protests that were taking place in London. And one particular incident really sparked the genesis of the book. So my old university, UCL, somebody informed me that a group of students from my old university, UCL, had sent a letter to the English faculty accusing the English faculty of institutional racism. But in that particular letter, they used the word BIPOC. And for those of you that don't know, BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So the students accused the faculty of racism against BIPOC people in the UK. Now, BIPOC would make sense in America. It would make perfect sense in America because the various indigenous communities in America have clearly been oppressed and discriminated against. What I found strange was what a word like BIPOC was doing in a UK context. When people talk about defending the rights or protecting the rights of indigenous communities in a UK context, that carries with it a far more far right resonance rather than something that you would expect a progressive activist to express. So that was the initial idea, the idea that all too often we unthinkingly internalize a very specifically American way of thinking about race and racism. So once that event happened, I started to reflect more seriously on the ways in which the experiences of black and other ethnic minority people in the UK differ from the experiences of ethnic minority people in America. And I think there are obvious striking differences when you think of demography, for example. So in America, the black American population constitutes about 13% of the overall American population, whereas in the UK, the black population constitutes only about 4% of the overall UK population. Another striking thing about America is that there are so many American cities and towns and communities across the southern Black Belt where the majority of the population are African Americans. Whereas in the UK, the area with the largest black population is London, and black people only constitute about 14% of the population in London. So in America, it's much easier to have an exclusively black social circle because the population of black people in America is much larger, and also because the history of segregation in America is still, the legacy of that is still present to this day. It's present in things like school, and it's also present in the ways in things like geography as well. By contrast, in the UK, I would say that something like school, for example, race isn't the dividing line in British schools. I would argue that class is. And if we look at, for example, just black people in the UK, what we notice is that when we use a term like the black British community, singular, that is in my mind an inadequate term, because I think it obscures the diversity within the label of black and British. So just to use a couple of examples, black Caribbean pupils in the UK are excluded at 3 times the rate of black African pupils. So if you're a black Caribbean pupil, you're 3 times more likely to be excluded from school than if you're a black African pupil. And I think differences like these matter because when we talk about inequality, I think they should be rooted in material circumstances rather than reflecting any kind of abstraction. So if we genuinely care about the inequalities in a society, we need to be more specific in our focus rather than making vast generalizations. This isn't just true of black British people in particular, but it's also true of all ethnic minority people. For example, the ethnic minority groups in the UK that tend to do best in terms of educational attainment are British Indian and British Chinese pupils. And therefore, I don't know, and therefore I think terms like BAME, B-A-M-E, are completely inadequate, because why should we assume that the experiences of, say, a British Indian person or a British Chinese person should necessarily align with the interests and also the experiences of a black Caribbean person, or even other supposedly white ethnic minority groups like the traveller and Roma communities as well, who tend to be discriminated most, I would argue, in terms of education and educational outcomes. So my book makes 2 main points, which is that in terms of race and ethnicity, we are not like America. That's the first point. The second point is that in terms of race and ethnicity, we need to be more specific in our focus, and we need to look at groups and also individuals, not through the lens exclusively of their race and ethnicity, but also take into account other various factors such as class, geography, culture, family formation, religion, language. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. It's important because it allows us to have a more fine-grained approach to thinking about and also trying to combat the inequalities in our society. But I think it's also important because I think it allows us to affirm the indivisible dignity of each and every individual as well. I'll stop for now and see if Mike has got questions for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Tomiwa. And you really, I think, highlight the kind of key message of the book, which is not to overgeneralize about issues of race and racism, and to recognize specificity and the need to locate these issues very clearly in particular country contexts. And I have to say, I'm a sociologist who has worked a lot on UK issues over most of my career, but also internationally, to increasing extent, actually working in South Africa and certain parts of Europe and parts of South America. I think you identify a really important point, which is really significant across the social sciences, which is the power of the American models which we work with. It's not just about race, it's about all sorts of ways in which we think, and the dominance of those models and the need to contest the kind of their power. Anecdotally, just to give you an example of how, the issues you raised strike chord with me in a number of ways. 4 or 5 years ago, I went to give a talk at the University of Curaçao, which is in the Dutch Caribbean, if any of you know it. It's a small island. It's still part of the Netherlands. It's still a colony of the Netherlands, if you want, and it was the centre of the Dutch slave trade. And I went, as part of this, my visit, I went to a museum of slavery, which is extremely interesting, and it really was nuanced in the specific experience of the Dutch slave trade, which I found very interesting. And then, right at the end of the museum, you suddenly enter this gallery, which is all about the 1960s American civil rights movement. Nothing to do with Curaçao, nothing to do with the Dutch, colonial experience, and suddenly you get plunged into Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And that sort of, it did feel very jarring, partly in the style in which it was done. So it struck me at the time. On the other hand, this is the question I put to you, I can see, because those motifs of the civil rights movement and the anti-racism of the 60s, because they were so powerful, and because they have such global currency, I can see they might still be important resources to draw upon all over the world, just because of their iconic power. Yeah. So, for those reasons, should we actually still, give some value and some, credibility to those messages in our thinking about race in the UK?
Yeah. I think that's a perfectly reasonable point to make, because but what I would say is that the lessons from the civil rights movement were not only adopted by black people across the world. Mm-hmm. So I know that in Northern Ireland, for example, the civil rights movements to try and protect the rights of Irish Catholic people in Northern Ireland were clearly inspired by the civil rights movements against white supremacism in America. Mm-hmm. So that underlying message of fighting against discrimination and inequality, I think, can be adopted by anyone, because it's all about the underlying principles rather than, say, any maybe particular fine-grained similarities or not. But yeah, I do think, because what many people would say is that, well, what about racial solidarity, the importance of racial solidarity? And I think that's a perfectly fair point to make. What I would say is that you can also have solidarity not on the basis of race, but on the basis of shared moral values. And the reason why I say that as well is because the idea of racial solidarity necessarily assumes that the values of black people across the world are necessarily the same, which is clearly not the case, because there are many black people that might be conservative. There are, of course, many black people that are liberal. There are many black people that are socialists. Black people do not constitute a homogeneous bloc. And I think the risk of just assuming that there is this shared racial solidarity presupposes that. I think solidarity should be ultimately predicated on shared moral values.
Thank you. Thank you much. Okay, so at the start of Tomiwa's book, you discuss a number of areas of theoretical thinking about how American models have become so influential, and one of the chapters is devoted to critical race theory, which is a really has become a very influential body of thought and very contentious in the US context. So, you know, some states are banning it because it seems to be too subversive and too radical and so on. And it's certainly gaining a lot of power and traction in the UK. And what you try and do is emphasise how it's rooted in the American experience.
Sure.
You look at the way in which notions of self-help and social mobility is all tied up with that critical race theory.
Yeah.
I take that, but I have to say, one area of critical race theory, which I find quite powerful, is actually what they talk about to do with the way in which white interests get institutionalised. Because my reading of critical race theory is it's talking about the way in which state structures and corporate structures, legal structures, are tied in with forms of racial power. Obviously, a classic example of that is apartheid in South Africa, but it can be generalised. A lot of your book is looking at, and very interesting and thoughtful ways of looking at the black experience. But if you are also, as we have to be, interested in kind of how white people are organised and how they're powerful, then I do think critical race theory can be useful in those terms. So I'm kind of wanting to say a bit about your reflections upon critical race theory. Can it be useful at all? Or should it be?
There's this idea amongst certain, in particular, American conservatives that see critical race theory as a kind of Marxism, as an ideology that's foreign to America. And I would argue that critical race theory is a fundamentally American way of looking at the world. It's rooted in American law, in American constitutional law. The founder of critical race theory was this man called Derek Bell, and he was a constitutional lawyer. And his central thesis, which has been shared and adopted by many subsequent people that espouse critical race theory, is that America has fundamentally failed to live up to the moral and constitutional values that it professes to believe. So I think it's American in that sense, because it still sees America as this exceptional moral country, even though it disavows that. But in disavowing that, it presupposes that America is the model by which race and racism and inequality should be judged. American values, should be the model by which these things should be judged and evaluated. What I would say about what you say about whiteness and about the protection of whiteness is that I guess it would depend on how widely or how thinly you would define whiteness, and we would be included in the category of whiteness. Because recently I wrote a column in which I said that racism, for example, isn't just something that affects only black and brown people. There are certain ethnic minority groups that are often racialized as whites, but nevertheless experience various forms of racism and discrimination. So I mentioned, for example, traveller and Roma communities, Irish people, and of course, Jewish people as well. So I think it would depend on how far and you would sort of define whiteness, because again, I don't think whiteness is this abstract thing which just exists out of particular material context and circumstances. Because ironically, and I would agree with them, many critical race theorists, I think, rightly argue that whiteness is an invention of circumstances. So they would argue that racism gave birth to race. Race did not give birth to racism. But nevertheless, many of them still cling to, I think, a very fixed notion of race and whiteness. So I think it would depend on how you define it.
Well, yeah, so my next question, in a way, touches on this issue from another angle. So in the second part of your book, you sort of talk about the lived experience of Black British people, you know, and explore that across different domains, and it's very interesting. And obviously, you draw upon your own experiences very intriguingly. And you make this really important point, which is about the fact that we should not assume, because there is racial disparity across many indicators of well-being, that means there's necessarily institutional racism causing these disparities. All sorts of reasons why there could be inequalities in the experiences or in the incomes or educational outcomes or whatever, different ethnic groups, different racial groups. Important point to recognise, you know, we cannot assume, we cannot read off from racial disparity that there is, you know, racism at work. So, but I was left a bit unclear at the end of it as to whether you think there is it's still useful to use the concept of institutional racism, whilst recognising it's not necessarily the only thing at work. But within certain areas it's important. Or whether you think the whole concept is in a way not really helping us unpack the.
I think there are circumstances where terms like institutional racism is useful. So the police, for example, or more recently the fire department. So there was that recent report that came out in December last year, which found institutional racism in the fire department. So I'm not opposed to the use of that term. I just think that racism is not the only thing that is causing inequalities in our society. I think there are two ways to look at it. If we assume that all ethnic minority people experience inequality simply on the basis of their race and nothing else, then I don't think you would be able to find a satisfactory way to account for the vast disparities in terms of educational outcome, employment outcome, and also interaction with the criminal justice system. So, for example, if we say that BAME people, for example, are oppressed by the police in the UK, then that applies, of course, to Black people, but it doesn't apply to British Chinese people and British Indian people. Which is not to say that racism doesn't cause the way in which Black people are oppressed by the police. I think it does. It's just to say that when we think about racism, we should have a more fine-grained and nuanced approach to it, rather than what I think is this very simplistic approach that many of us have adopted.
Okay. Lots of questions bubbling up, I'm sure, with this. Let me ask my last question. Then we can throw it open to the audience. Because you also have a chapter on empire, and of course that's a really contentious issue, isn't it? And for instance, Winston Churchill, you know, who is pretty clearly racist. You know, if you read it, you know, he doesn't hide his tracks very well. You can find all sorts of quotes about what he thought about Indians and Black people and so forth. And yet, you know, he was the kind of saviour of Britain during the Second World War. So kind of how we deal with the legacy of empire, which is deeply contentious. And of course, LSE, like all universities, is thinking about decolonisation, what it means to try and become an open space, an inclusive space, which is not privileged on certain assumptions. So I wondered if perhaps you want to talk a little bit about what you think about empire, but also putting back to you the issue, because you might say that the point you began with, or the book focuses on, about the dominance of the American model, in a way that is the sign of colonial power almost.
Yeah, you could say
so it's actually, are you calling for a certain kind of decolonisation? So we still need to have that in our mind, even though we may contest some of the ways in which it's argued for.
Yeah, but I think the American thing is more of it's a cultural thing. It's a cultural imperial thing, because it's not something which is coerced or done through violence. I think, again, with the issue of empire, I think the debate about it is too morally simplistic, and it lacks any sense of sophistication and nuance. And I think even when we talk about what it means to be a colonized subject, or what it means to experience colonialism, we need to take it on a case-by-case basis rather than just looking at it through one singular perspective. So the experiences of empire for a Black Caribbean person in the UK is, in general, quite different to the experiences of how a Black African person would experience empire. So just to say, and this is something I forgot to mention earlier, so up until about 25 years ago, the majority of Black British people in the UK were Black Caribbean people. But over the past 20, 25 years, there's been a massive influx of immigration from Africa, and now there are twice as many Black African people in the UK as Black Caribbean people, which means that the majority of Black people in the UK, as of today, are not the descendants of the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. And I think being the descendants of enslaved Africans taken to the New World, deprived of your language, your culture, your origins, shapes the way that you look at society, I think. I think it must influence the way you look at society. And I think that if you are a Black African person, you are, in the UK, you are either, as of today, either an immigrant or the children of immigrants, and you came to the UK from an independent African country, and you still retain your language, your distinct culture. And so I think even though these two Black communities share the same experience, even though these two Black communities are both colonized, share the same history of colonialism, there are important differences within that history. And I think that this also needs to be incorporated in debates as well. I think another thing I'll mention is that when we think of British Asian people as well, we need to be more nuanced in our discussion. So, for example, I mentioned in my book the experiences of British Asian people whose families immigrated from Africa, from East Africa, and many of them are now senior members of the Tory party, yes. Including our current Prime Minister.
Yes.
But I think one way to explain, because this is something that some people have wondered, why is it the case that many British Asian people from African backgrounds espouse conservative values? And I think one way to think about it is to acknowledge the fact that if you come from that particular background, you basically can't trust the state to protect you. So you have an attitude where you need to rely upon your own individual work ethic. You need to be a capitalist in that sense, because you can't necessarily trust the state, because the state didn't protect Asian communities in post-colonial Uganda and Kenya. And I think that assumption is carried through to many of them. And I think this is different. This is very different to the experiences of British, Pakistani or British Bangladeshi people that came to the UK from Asia. So again, and both these all of these Asian communities all share broadly the same experiences of colonialism and colonization, but the way that manifests itself is different. And I think we need to acknowledge and incorporate those differences in thinking about it and analyzing race.
Okay, great. We have all these airplanes flying over at the moment, but if we can try and just keep those out of our earshot. So I think it's time to open it up for questions. We have about 25 minutes left. So what we'll try and do is, I think, make it into a bit of a discussion rather than a Q&A backwards and forwards. And I'm looking at Pete to see if there are any online questions. No, nothing online. So let's just take perhaps 3 questions from the floor, and then we can have some answers afterwards. Okay, yes, you at the back there. And please say who you are and name and affiliation, please.
Hello, my name is Calvin. I represent the interests of European Banti, which is a non-profit organization dealing with China-Europe stuff. So obviously, I am white. I'm very white. If you put me outside, I'll reflect the sun. But I'm also from South Africa. I'm born and raised in that country. I was raised speaking English, Afrikaans, and Xhosa. I did the whole shebang. So you both touched upon whiteness. I'd be interested in both of your perspectives on what whiteness is. And then also the other topic is, I couldn't agree more. I think it was profoundly salient what you're saying about recognizing the individuality of experience. Vehemently agree, but do you not think it's useful to retain these umbrella terms to better start and initiate these conversations? Because it's a kind of
Sorry, I think the plane is drowning your voice.
It's a good starting point to have these umbrella terms,
Yeah.
to be able to initiate conversations
Yeah.
when there's already such strong resistance against just having the conversation at all.
Sure.
I feel like greater individuality may drown out the conversation. So just the lines between that and what you think.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How would you define whiteness, Mike?
Well, you can start. Actually, anyone else want to ask any questions, or should we look at that one first? Yeah, at the back there, the white cap. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Tom. I'm a student out of Manchester Grammar School. I think your talk is... I think your talk has been, honestly, just bang on. But how strong do you think is the relationship between class, more so bourgeois class ownership, and the kind of rejection of solidarity in race, solidarity in values, solidarity in moral values, and class? Because I remember I studied this 2 days ago. I heard about it. It was Kenya, where a lot of British Asian people have immigrated from, and Priti Patel, I think Priti Patel's family come from that, and that she kind of has forwarded this rhetoric of consistent anti-critical race theory, which it seems kind of confusing considering her background. But do you think it could be explained by perhaps a class and perhaps a economic status?
Yeah. Did you pick up any of that?
Sort of how class and economics explains.
Yeah. Do you want to start on that? I'll say a few words.
Yeah, I do think class is the major elephant in the room when it comes to conversations about inequalities in our society. And there's something else that I forgot to mention, which I think, again, relates to class. So I went to a state comprehensive school in London, and my school was both ethnically mixed, but also mixed in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds as well. But the striking thing about my school is that both the white middle class kids and the white working class kids were all friends, or at least friendly, with all the ethnic minority kids of whatever class background. But the white working class kids, generally speaking, were not friends with the white middle class kids, and vice versa. And this is something that I've only really noticed in retrospect, which I find fascinating, because when we tend to think about inequality in education, we tend to think of the division between private schools and state schools. But even within state schools, I still think there is that important socioeconomic divide, to the point of the ways in which class interest influences people's political beliefs. I think that is true to an extent, but again, I'm skeptical about any kind of reductionist way of looking at things. So even though I do think that is true to an extent, I can't say that class definitively shapes the way that people look at the world in terms of the values that they espouse.
Let me try and link the two questions, because you asked about my thoughts on whiteness, but also about class. And I've done a lot of work on class over many years, most famously, I suppose, with the Great British Class Survey, which came out about 10 years ago. They had this big BBC web survey, and everyone could tick in their few questions and see which class they were in. You can still do it if you're interested. If you Google class calculator, you can find out which class you're in. So I've always been interested in class. I also went to a comprehensive school in London, so different generation, different race, but some overlaps there. But I've also got really interested more in the kind of overlap between racial divisions and class divisions in a certain kind of way, and particularly at the top end, particularly around the elite and the upper middle class, because, and just to give you a flavour of some of the overlaps, which I think are very powerful. If you've got time after this, you can look at the maps we have over there in the festival exhibition, and I have a little, I have some maps on the work we have done on UK non-domiciled taxpayers. So these non-doms, as they're often called, are people who they're living in the UK. So they're living in the UK, they have to file a tax return, but they claim they're non-domiciled, which means that they're claiming that their permanent home is somewhere else in the world. And if you do that, you get certain tax breaks, mainly that you don't have to pay any tax on your overseas assets. You probably all know that the wife of the Prime Minister famously was outed as a non-dom last year and caused a bit of consternation. But the interesting thing is, so this is a kind of tax perk for certain kinds of people. And on the whole, non-doms are wealthy people, because these days you have to pay a fee to claim as a non-dom. So the only reason you pay that fee is if you have big assets to hide. But the overarching, the kind of people who we think, I should mention my colleagues, Aaron Nadvani and David Burgo and Andy Summers on this project, the kind of people who we think are these non-doms, even though they're international by definition, is very much predominantly white elites, because the countries in which they tend to have come from, or which they claim as their nationality, are places like Australia and Canada, USA, other European nations, South Africa, but we assume it's mostly white South Africans. So I do think at the privileged end of the social spectrum, if you like, the whiteness and the upper class categories do overlap. And I think that is a very powerful feature of the British class structure. I had a PhD student called Emma Taylor, who graduated last year. She's working in the LSE now as LSE Fellow, teaches our undergraduate students, who did this wonderful ethnographic, detailed study of a British private school, one of Britain's top private schools, actually. She's a teacher there. And it's, at one level, not all the kids are white these days. Okay, so there are a smattering, more than a smattering of minority kids. But she was also interested in, despite the fact the school talks about diversity all the time, makes a big fuss about we're really open, actually the assumptions are still based around these forms of whiteness and sort of kind of imperial assumptions, including things like getting people's names wrong in the awards ceremony and things like that. So my feeling is that sure, in some ways there is more diversity at the top, but we should not really necessarily assume there's a fundamental change in the cultural values. And I think you see that in the way governments operate. I could talk much more about this, but any more questions?
There's a question.
Yeah. Yes? Yeah.
Hello, thank you. That's very interesting. My question is about this obsession with America and taking it as a model. I found I'm Franco-British. I was born in France, and the issue of racism, for instance, is reframing some of the discourses in France. In France, the word race is racist. You can't really say la race is a racist word in itself. It's a bit odd. So black people who at the moment are sort of reclaiming, they called it racialized people, reclaiming the word. Anyway, but my question, I haven't read your book yet, is about, don't you think there's also in this obsession, you said it, perhaps black people think the situation is the same or are making parallels, but I think white people as well in this country are using America as a way not to actually look at themselves. And I remember when Trump came, suddenly everybody, let's just all meet in front of number 10, And I was thinking, this is a bit weird, that you have a dysfunctional government and you're not going to go on the street, but Trump is coming and that's a big issue. Anyway, so that's my question. Is that, I don't know whether you talk about that.
Question. Let's try and get a couple, shall we? And then we can get some answers. Yeah, you.
Hi. My question, my name's Shadia. It's actually very similar to the gentleman. We do know that terms like BAME and BIPOC just don't account for all the things that you've spoken about today. But where do we kind of go from here to still have that racial solidarity but move past these terms? Like, what do you think is next?
Good question. One more, perhaps, if there is one. Yeah, the gentleman over there.
Yes, there are a number of issues there that are profound in many respects. My question is relating to colonialism and empire, as you mentioned. I'm just curious as to whether you mentioned values internalized both in the USA and in UK. But let's be realistic. In terms of what interest, control both institutions and economics globally. In your experience, do you think combating inequalities and exclusion, but we need a new, say, international or global model to combat the disparities?
Thank you. Okay, do you want to reply to some of those?
Any and all.
Any and all.
Yeah, I do take your points about the way that some white people would use the phrase Britain is not America, therefore we shouldn't focus on race at all. I think that's a valid and valuable point to make. What I would say is that just focusing on race is not enough, I think. Because just to use your example of France, for example, so in the 50s and the 60s, many African Americans, as I'm sure you know, moved to France. And the reason why they moved to France was because they felt that France was a far less racist country than America. And they felt that they felt liberated when they moved to France. So I'm thinking of writers like Richard Wright and James Baldwin. But what was striking is that, so there was another African American that moved to France. I think his name is William Gardner Smith. And what he said and what he wrote is that even though many African Americans moved to France, they saw France as this fantastically liberating country, many of them failed to pay any attention to the racism and discrimination against Algerian people. So when they were in France in the 50s and 60s, this was during the time of the Algerian War of Independence, where there was incredible racism and violence done to the Algerian people and other colonized subjects in Francophone North Africa. And again, I think this links back to my point, which is that it's all about emphasis and all about focus and all about nuance, because from their perspective, France was a perfect country. But from the perspective of somebody from Algeria or from Francophone North Africa, France was the oppressor. Again, I think that's why emphasis is important and nuance is important, and taking national context into account is important. In terms of, because I think those two questions are interlinked.
Yep.
I do think we should, I do think we should have a more international approach to inequality. But I think that there is a risk in if we just have a blanket approach, we can't take into account the way that inequality manifests in each particular country. So we can't take into account the particular or peculiar ways that racial and other forms of inequality manifest in each country, which is why again I emphasize the importance of solidarity on the basis of shared values, shared moral values, rather than solidarity on the basis of being non-white, which I find, which I also find quite condescending as well, and quite patronizing. The idea that simply because I share a lack with somebody else, that we're both non-white, that we should necessarily have a shared sense of solidarity. And I think another reason why is it also doesn't take into account the fact that there are various non-white countries across the world where anti-black racism is still a very prevalent force. And there are various non-white countries in the world where other forms of racism against other non-white ethnic minorities is still a prevalent force.
What about the issue about the BAME term, which I think is what it is?
Yeah. So I think I understand why BAME exists, because it tries to make sense of racism and inequality, but I'm still skeptical about the way it's applied, the applicability of the term, because it's not clear to me what. So, for example, would Traveller and Roma people be included in BAME?
Sure.
Yes. The fact that that's not even clear is a bit confusing to me. And people of color is another term which I find a bit perplexing, because it's not clear to me how you would define color in that way.
It's partly a question about politics, though, isn't it?
Exactly.
if you don't have that term,
for
all these problems, what term do we use instead?
Yeah.
But let's get some final round of questions, and then, there's one over here.
Hi, my name is Saurav. I am born and brought up in India, so I'm very new here. It's been 2 years. I work as an economist in climate policy. And my question is a bit contemporary organizational question. When I came here and I started looking at organization, how they function, I found it very interesting that they all had DEI committees, diversity and inclusion. And the way they operate it, I find it very weird, and the values and the way it kind of boils down on how they practice these DEI values. So I wanted to ask you this question on these diversity committees that apparently every organization has now. I'm sure LSE has as well. And try to kind of really, because I don't have an opinion and view on these committees, but there are definitely some pros in the way they approach this problem. But at the same time, it becomes a compliance thing for many organizations to do it. So do you have any opinion or stance on these DEI committees, what they're doing right, where they're completely getting the point wrong?
Yeah, it seems like every organization has one. Somebody was telling me that the Times, they've got a diversity and equity and inclusion committee. I wonder if they managed to get Rupert Murdoch to come and attend that. Again, I think the risk in a lot of these initiatives is that many organizations would say that, well, we've got a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. Therefore, we've done our bit. Therefore, we can move on. Which I think is a risk, because many organizations would approach it in a very cynical manner. And I think it relates again to what you were saying earlier about the way some people sort of promote diversity without actually materially changing the institutions.
I mean, if I can just offer a thought on that too.
Exactly.
Because the LSE is I think the LSE is really exposed on this issue, actually, because we have a very diverse student body. But if you look at the senior professoriate at the LSE, it's incredibly white. And LSE is kind of aware of it, and there are kind of policies in place. But but I think this also goes back to the issue about how certain kinds of whiteness do get institutionalized, and actually, in the case of the LSE, it is being recorded, but hopefully it's not going to cause too many ructions up front. They value the best thing you can do if you're an LSE academic is to publish in an American journal. They're the best in the world, therefore, the more you publish in the American Sociological Review, the better it is for your career. So you're absolutely right that those forms of privilege and whiteness and eliteness go hand in hand with a valuing of America as the kind of dominant force. So in that respect, I think you're really on a powerful thing. But there are specific issues, definitely, around how we tackle diversity. Yeah. And I think I'm sure in the Times it probably is a bit of window dressing.
Definitely.
But it doesn't mean it's not important, actually, in numerous environments. Okay, we got perhaps...
Is that a question?
Yes, if it's a question, over here. Just wait for the microphone.
Thanks. Whilst sort of fully agreeing with the drift of what you're saying, I'm surprised you don't make more of the of anti-Semitism in supporting your case. I'm sure you've read David Baddiel's book.
I mentioned anti-Semitism in my book.
Right.
I did mention it earlier.
Okay. Yes, you did. I'm just surprised you didn't. I mean, after all, the greatest crime of the 20th century was committed against the Jews. I'm just wondering if this is a sort of partly an ideological thing to do with the left's obsession with those they identify as being suitable victims of racism, which do not include Jews. I mean, are you supportive of that? notion.
Supportive of what?
Of the notion that the left tend to exclude Jews from their model of racial victimization.
I think it's definitely true of parts of the left. So I think the cleric's example of this is Diane Abbott, who recently wrote a letter to a column written in The Observer, which argued that racism affects other ethnic minority groups often racialized as white, including Jews, and she mentioned that she said that Jews were not forced to sit at the back of the bus in Jim Crow America, and they were not discriminated against in apartheid South Africa, without, of course, mentioning the greatest genocide of the 20th century. So I do think there is definitely a part of the left which doesn't incorporate anti-Semitism into their analysis, because anti-Semitism is a very particular kind of racism. It's a racism against a group that's seen as more powerful, rather than a racism against a group that's seen as less powerful. And in fact, a social democrat called August Bebel once described anti-Semitism as the socialism of the fools, by which I think it meant that it appeals to somebody that's a bit obsessed with conspiratorial power. And I think a risk of seeing everything in a slightly conspiratorial sense is that it can lend itself to anti-Semitism, which again links to what I was saying about racial disparities and the inequalities in society, because I think increasingly some people would say that, oh, well, you know, Jewish people, they seem like quite a privileged community, therefore they can't be victims of racism, and that lends credibility, or that provides lends credibility to one of the key tropes of anti-Semitism.
Okay, I think we're probably reaching the end. As you can see, Tomiwa's book opens up lots of issues. I really encourage you to read it, and it really elaborates the debate on race and racism in the UK.
Out in 5 days, in all good bookshops,
and
some bad ones as well.
But you can also sign it over here, I believe. I believe if you want to get a copy.
They're available, they're available over there.
You might even sign it afterwards if you're going to hang around.
Yes, definitely.
So thank you everyone so much, Tomiwa. Thank you for coming, and can you please give a warm round of applause?
Thank you.